For the audience as well. Yeah, we'll just wait for a couple of minutes for others to join as well.
Hi, Aayushi. Good morning.
Hello, Professor. Good morning. Or good evening for you, maybe.
Thanks for agreeing to give this talk.
Of course, it's my honor.
Yeah, good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Firstly, today's webinar is on the topic, can we disrupt the climate debt doom loop in US cities? And the webinar has been organized by the Center for Climate Studies, IIT Bombay. And we would also like to welcome Professor Shubhamal Ghosh and Professor Tupti Mishra to today's webinar. And today's speaker is Aayushi Mishra, who is a doctoral candidate at Northeastern University's Sustainability and Data Science Lab. Her work focuses on how physical climate risk shapes infrastructure investment, financial markets, and equity outcomes in the US and also at the global scale. And her topic for today revolves around understanding how financing requirements for infrastructure at the municipal level require us to consider future climate risks as well. So thank you for joining us today, Aayushi. Over to you for the presentation.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I will start sharing my screen. I hope this works. Okay. I hope I'm visible.
Yes, yeah.
So, good evening, everybody. Hello from Boston. It's early morning here, so it's a great way to start the day. My name is Aayushi, and I'm honored to present some of my research to you today. Most of what I'll be showing you today stems from our recently published paper in Nature Cities. I'll have the link to that paper at the end of the slideshow. But yeah, I will ask you the question, can we disrupt the climate debt doom loop in US municipalities? So much of today's talk is going to be US centric, but I think where you might be more interested in is the climate risk aspect. That's universal at this point. I think there isn't a single city in the world that is immune to the effects of climate change. So I think these findings are transferable to a certain extent. The financing mechanism might be a little different. So let's get into it. So I wanted to briefly touch on my professional trajectory before we start discussing the research aspects. I received my bachelor's in biology and environmental studies, after which I received my master's in environmental science and policy. I worked in consulting for a few years before starting my PhD journey. I'm in my third year, so fingers crossed we're over the halfway point, I hope. So yeah, this paper has been a really important milestone in my professional journey. So there are three concepts that are important for this presentation. So first, insurance, and by insurance, I mean property and casualty insurance, has been a long financial safety net for climate disasters. Insurance and mortgages, so home ownership, have been tied closely together for the past many decades, but climate risk has been impacting property values, right? And loan viabilities. And then finally, and this is the concept that's fairly unknown, is the US municipal bond market. This market is the backbone of US public infrastructure. So I'm going to talk a lot about this market. Um, we should care about all of this because climate risk is on its way to destabilizing this dynamic in a very significant manner. And there's still time for interventions and for opportunities, I like to say. So the municipal bond market is how 70 to 80% of infrastructure, public infrastructure, is financed in this country. And so by that I mean roads, bridges, water systems, public schools, all of those are financed through this market. So it's roughly a $4 trillion market, and it's quite decentralized. There are around 50,000 individual issuers. Um, and this is so surprising, I think, to a lot of audiences, is there's this one market that finances so much of what's around us, but there's very little awareness about it. And once you layer in climate risk, it becomes even more of a, okay, we should maybe start paying attention to this. So one of the most common questions I get is, are muni bonds the same as state bonds? So they're a little different. Those are issued by the states. So state bonds are backed by the full revenue base of the state, whereas muni bonds are issued by cities, counties, utilities, school districts, and they're backed by a much narrower local tax base or service revenues. And why that's important is local climate shocks, such as floods or fires or hurricanes or tornadoes, they can directly weaken that revenue that supports that local debt. So the municipal bond market is quite idiosyncratic, very nuanced. And as a researcher, that makes things a little harder because, as most of you know, we're always trying to look for trends and generalizations. And this is one of those things where it's a little hard to do that. There are many different types of debt, many legal structures, and many assumptions that are built into the pricing mechanisms. And I think it's because of that complexity that climate risk is often treated as one of those things that are in the background where, yeah, it's there, but we can think about it later. Even though these bonds are financing the very assets that are physically exposed. So increasingly, it's becoming one of those things that we can no longer ignore, and it needs to be built into the pricing. And that is one of the main arguments we're making in our research paper. So this we don't really need to get into too much. This is more an FYI, but local governments here typically issue three different types of debt. First, you have general obligation debt, which is backed by broad taxes. So if property values fall after a disaster, that security is going to weaken. On the flip side, we have revenue debt, which is repaid from specific services such as water bills or transit fares, and that's contingent upon people continuing to live there and continuing to pay for that service. So, for example, if after a disaster, a lot of people move away, the revenue debt gets impacted. And then you have something called special assessment debt, which is repaid by specific properties, which can get very vulnerable in localized climate damage scenarios. So obviously there are many more. Like I said, it's a very complex market, but for the purposes of this presentation, these are the three that matter the most. So I think it's a bit abstract right now. It's like, wait, so what are these bonds? Like, who decides the price of it? So I thought it would be useful to have like a very simple breakdown. Of course, it's usually more complicated than this, and I think every city might do things a little differently. But basically, just let's say a city wants to say build a bridge. So they issue a bond for it, and they put out a request for proposals or an RFP. Typically, banks respond to it. So the banks are known as underwriters. One of the banks gets picked based on the bank's performance with all of these things. And once the bank gets picked or the underwriter gets picked, they start to look at the city's finances and recent bond sales. And they say, we suggest this as the starting yield. And then that starting yield is effectively the interest rate that investors are going to earn. And so investors focus on credit ratings, which is basically a report card that cities get. Every city has a rating. Usually it's set by agencies such as Standard and Poor's or S&P Global or Moody's or Fitch. So those are usually the ones that set, the city of Boston has a double A rating or a triple A rating, things like that. So investors look at that. They also look at the current financial conditions, and there's an interest rate locked in at the time of issuance. So if a disaster or some sort of shock happens later on, the bond price drops in what we call the secondary market, which is where the bonds are traded. And these have ramifications, long-term ramifications for the city, for the investors, for the insurance agencies, the credit rating agencies, and so on. So, oops, sorry. So our paper wanted to focus on a significantly understudied topic in academic literature, which is, okay, great. We have this bond market, which already is understudied. And then once you layer in physical climate risk, what's that dynamic like? Does the bond market care about things like climate risk yet? So, um, like I said, it's relatively understudied, which is surprising given how prevalent this market is in our day-to-day life. You can't be in a single city in the US without it having some sort of relationship with the bond market. And I like to think there isn't a single city in the US that is absent from some sort of physical climate risk. So it's imperative to start, researching this. So we identified a lot of challenges, and as we all know, scoping out your research paper is key. So we narrowed it down to three main challenges. So the first, we found that the US bond market is currently underpricing climate risks. That's due to a myriad of reasons. It's due to things like inconsistent disclosures, short-term credit horizons, and investor inattention. Um, Another thing we argue is as markets do eventually begin to price in this risk, it's going to be the high risk and under-resourced communities that are going to face higher borrowing costs to finance their infrastructure. And they might have a reduced access to affordable capital to build their schools and bridges and roads. And then finally, we argue that there is limited fiscal capacity and political constraints that are perhaps keeping climate adaptation planning a little disconnected from municipal finance. So that is weakening long-term resilience and long-term creditworthiness. This, I think, is helpful to just understand who are the stakeholders. There are so many more, but there's only so many you can fit on a figure. So this is a figure from our paper. It just shows you how layered the stakeholders are. Sometimes there are overlaps. So state governments are in the innermost circle and then the middle circle as well. And this is just to show that it's a very interconnected network and it's pretty complicated. But this also shows you that perhaps there are so many opportunities for meaningful collaboration between these stakeholders. So I think it's given that the muni market has been around for decades, why do we need to care about this now? And as I mentioned earlier, muni bonds, insurance, and mortgages have all been a core part of how the US functions for the past many decades. So this is important to think about now because in the last few years, there have been some moving parts that have forced investors, issuers, insurers, all the people in the previous figure to start rethinking some things because certain things have shifted over the past, I would say, 10 years or so. So there have been some safety nets that have begun eroding. One of those is insurance. Over the past few years, private insurance agencies have begun exiting high risk markets. And by that, I mean entire US states, for example, um, have been deemed too high of a risk. So private insurers such as AIG, State Farm, Allstate, these are huge insurance agencies. They have said, you know what, the entire state of Florida is uninsurable for us. So we are going to exit the state of Florida. So there's going to be no new coverage provided for property owners in that state, which if I said that to someone 15, 20 years ago, they would have laughed at me. But this is happening. And it's not just Florida, it's happening in other states as well. So this is a huge safety net that is no longer dependable for property owners in certain high risk areas. And so what's happening is virtually every US state has something called public insurance, which is also known as insurance of last resort. Um, what this means is if a property owner is unable to afford private insurance, the state says, okay, no worries, you can get on our state-backed coverage. But like I said, it's an insurer of last resort. It's meant for, like once you have no other option. But because so many private insurers are withdrawing from these high-risk states, there is a huge influx of policyholders that are turning to these last resort insurers. And these programs were not designed to withstand such a large number of policyholders. So basically, because of private insurer withdrawal, the strain is falling onto state budgets. And then that is trickling down to the city level. So after the states transfer the costs onto cities, municipalities are increasingly having to choose between do we invest in infrastructure? Do we invest in disaster recovery? Do we increase taxes? If so, there are limits to how much we can do that. Um, and then once you think of repeated disasters, so while cities and states are grappling with this, they're also like, all right, we are getting another wildfire. Great. So you have the big safety net that's no longer there. So overall, it's a very uncertain time. And if you're looking at things from the financial market side, yeah, that's very precarious of a situation to be in right now. So just to recap what I showed you before private insurance companies used to bear a lot of the risk, but that has since moved on to state governments. And subsequently, that risk and that burden of responsibility does trickle down to the local government level. So the first safeguard that's eroding is private insurance. The second one that has been eroding for years and years now is FEMA, or the Federal Emergency Management Agency. Um, that agency has been facing budgetary constraints for many years. Every year, they were virtually running out of money. They needed, another $100 billion, another so and so $1 billion. And then every hurricane these days is costing a couple billion. So it was just like this system that perhaps wasn't working. So the federal government in recent years has been shifting recovery responsibilities onto states. This is a new thing for states to now consider, because historically, FEMA has been providing billions of dollars in relief to states in the aftermath of a disaster. So if there was a $1 billion hurricane, private insurance would step in and help cover some of the damages, given the coverage limitations. And then FEMA would come in and say, we got you for this and this. And then the states would have to pay for some of the things. And then eventually, property owners would have to pay out of pocket for the remainder. Now, if this agency gets dissolved or dismantled, states are going to need to secure that financing from other sources. So, once again, municipalities are increasingly considering the bond market to finance not just infrastructure, but now finance recovery mechanisms as well. So, again, to recap, when a climate shock damages infrastructure, insurance and federal aid might be falling short. So, cities might increasingly begin issuing more debt to recover. And that debt assumes that tax bases and service revenues are going to remain stable. It also makes a lot of climate related assumptions. It's assuming that those disasters are infrequent, they're localized, and they're fairly recoverable. And if that doesn't happen, if that stable tax base and service revenue isn't stable, that has the ability to raise borrowing costs, it can delay adaptation, and it can have decades-long implications. So this assumption becomes very fragile once you incorporate the fact that climate shocks are becoming repeated rather than rare. Now that we know how bonds get issued and how bond prices get determined, it would be helpful to see, what does pricing in climate risk look like in a high risk area? As in, what is Aayushi trying to argue for? What would that look like? So, as we discussed earlier, a city again wants to build a bridge. It issues the bond, it puts out that RFP, a bank gets hired. Um, when the city issues a bond, in this case, what we're arguing is it would prepare the same official statements, and this time it would disclose any and all climate risks. So it would say, FYI, our city is prone to frequent floods in the months of October and November. Great, that has been disclosed. So in this climate aware process, physical climate exposure is made explicit in the disclosure statements. So the bank or the underwriter will combine that information with any external third party climate data, insurance data, and it's going to evaluate, okay, this is how investors are likely going to react. And the bank will likely say, had you not disclosed, the initial yield would have been 3%. Now it's going to be 4%, probably. And so the city will say, okay, fair enough. We did disclose that there is a higher risk. And so the risk is reflected at the time of issuance and not later. So now you're probably like, well, why on earth would I ever disclose the risk if it's going to be more expensive for me, the city? And that's a very fair question. I think that's the question most cities are arguing for right now. So, very simply, if you disclose today, early pricing would mean you have to pay 4%, let's say. Late pricing would mean 3% today, but the next time you issue a bond, and by then, if you have been hit by certain disasters, or if investors want to consider climate risk, it would mean a steeper rise. So, like 5.5, 6%, 7% later on, which could be as soon as next month. So, you are essentially cushioning the risk for yourself, for your city, for the next many decades by being very upfront. Credit rating agencies will say, you know what, the transparency, we will take that into consideration. Um, Sounds good. So this is more of covering yourself now, knowing that your city will be exposed to frequent disasters down the line. And what we argue is it's not just from the goodness of the city's heart that you should be doing this. This has strategic implications as well. I think there are a lot of pros rather than this one con, which is, it's going to be pricier today. A city issues multiple bonds all year long. It has to finance all sorts of things. And those bonds can be anywhere from a 5-year bond to a 40-year bond. And keep that in mind. The issuance time is where that interest rate gets locked in, right? So it's important to think of this for the next many decades. So we include what we call a climate debt doom loop, which sounds really sad um, and depressing, but we end the paper with opportunities to disrupt this doom loop, so it's not as depressing. But instead of throwing that at you, I thought it would be useful to kind of build it together. So the first challenge, that climate risk is underpriced. Um, this represents the yellow circles. So what we find is investors tend to react after disasters rather than before them. So there's a lack of proactiveness. It's very reactive. Um, Disclosures are currently inconsistent. They're not standardized. They're not mandated by any governments. And there are also misaligned time horizons. By that, I mean credit rating agencies operate on a 3 to 5 year time scale. Insurance underwriters operate on an annual underwriting time scale. Um, Climate adaptation plans are 10 to 20 years in the future. So there is a lot of misalignment in the timelines from these different stakeholders. And it's important to then realize that when climate risk is going to be priced in, there it is going to happen very suddenly, and borrowing costs are going to jump up quickly. I am saying it with confidence that climate risk will be priced in, and the reason for that is it could be any one of those things. It could be that credit rating agencies today can say, as of today, we will be giving greater weightage to climate risk when we give that report card rating to the cities. So cities will say, wait, oh, and investors will suddenly start pricing that into their own decision making. It could be that if there are just simply too many disasters, investors will have no choice but to pay attention. It could be that disclosures could become mandatory by a state government or the federal government. So any one of those things might result in abrupt repricing. So what we argue here is the effects of repricing are going to impact the. So if you imagine a Venn diagram, right? One circle has high physical risk cities. Um, Another circle has cities that are fairly low income, they're under-resourced, they don't have as many staff working for them. The tax base isn't that high because of the property values perhaps not being so high. And then the middle, the overlap of that Venn diagram are the cities that are going to be the highest risk. And those are the cities where repricing is going to hit them hardest. Um, those are the cities that need disaster recovery the most and might not be able to afford it. And you would be surprised how many cities fall under that middle part. So those cities typically have the least financial flexibility and might be most vulnerable to disasters. And then the last part of our climate debt doom loop is the fact that many cities have these beautiful climate adaptation plans. They are so nice, heartwarming, makes you feel like there is going to be a better future for us. But those plans are often not linked to capital budgets of the city, or they're not part of debt decisions. So as a result, adaptation projects are often delayed or they're canceled because they're just not part of the budget this year. Maybe we can try next year. And so once you incorporate the fact that local budgets are going to remain strained due to the climate shocks and the burden of responsibility falling down to them, newer climate shocks are going to cause more and more localized damage. And so in some cities, um, and this is frustrating, but very understandable because cities are doing their best here, right? Cities are even approving high risk development just to preserve the revenue, just to keep the engine moving. One example of this is Miami, Florida, um, still continues to approve waterfront development on those beautiful coastlines, knowing that there is a high flood risk. But they keep doing that because of the short-term revenue they would get from the property taxes. And again, it's understandable, right? Miami does need to finance all of the things that it needs to, and it needs to find ways to do so. So in our paper, we argue for other innovations that cities can consider that perhaps might be less disruptive from a climate risk perspective, but are still disrupting this specific doom loop. So, I briefly wanted to touch on this very important topic of climate migration. For those who might not know, this is just a phenomenon, very generally speaking, where individuals and businesses they get displaced temporarily or semi-permanently or permanently sometimes due to the impacts of extreme weather or chronic climate change. So a city that is very prepared with this doom loop, they're like, noted, we got it. We are going to safeguard our communities from these climate shocks. Um, and we are going to align our climate adaptation plans with the financing. Even those cities are not going to be immune. So these cities, and especially if they have lower physical climate risk compared to their other neighboring cities, they are increasingly going to be perceived as climate havens. And those cities also need to prepare for other things. So it's never stopping. If you're a city planner, you don't get to sleep at this point, because those cities need to actively prepare for sudden influxes of people moving in. And so that means impacts on local infrastructure, services, city budgets, community dynamics, and more. And this isn't something theoretical that I'm just, hypothetically putting out there. This is already happening. So here's a case study from California, um, a very destructive fire in a city called Paradise. Um, Paradise, California, 95% of it got destroyed because of this wildfire. Um, it displaced roughly 20,000 people, so 85% of the town, and most of whom migrated to the closest city of Chico. Now, Chico in this scenario was considered a climate haven. It was lower risk, it wasn't as exposed to the wildfire effects. Um, and so this case study in itself can be an hour-long presentation in itself. But if anyone's interested, there is a really good paper by Morandi and Main, 2019, 2018, 2019, that covers this in great detail. But very briefly, what happened was because people moved to Chico pretty much overnight, it had a lot of implications. So migration has cascading impacts on not just the abandoned region, but the destination region as well. So if you are a stakeholder on either side, you need to plan for these impacts. So this figure is meant to show you that both of those cities need to, consider the implications. So Paradise, for example, had outmigration, which led to local tax revenues declining, which had a local impact on the infrastructure and the services, especially due to the decline in property values. But on the flip side, Chico suddenly faced skyrocketing rents and property values. Infrastructure and services became very overwhelmed. I believe the housing was already at capacity at the point, and then you have an influx of 20,000 people seeking housing suddenly. Um, and there were some disturbing things that emerged from this. People who were already living in Chico over the next few weeks got priced out of their rental apartments, or people in that city got outbidded for housing because the wealthier people of Paradise came in and they were like, I will pay tens of thousands of dollars more to get this house. And the seller was like, sold, perfect. So there were gentrification implications that emerged from one wildfire in one town over to the next town. So, what would it look like if there was another wildfire a week later in a neighboring town? So this has a lot of implications. So this we don't need to spend too much time on, but the doom loop has migration implications as well. So if you have eroding tax bases and then you have subsequent degradation in infra and services, um, those who are able to move are going to do so at their earliest convenience. This is the highly mobile group in green. They're usually the more affluent people, and their departure is what is known as capital flight. Once that happens, it further reduces investment incentives in that city, and it kind of reinforces more of an economic decline. So if the wealthier businesses move out, wealthier residents move out, the city will face the implications and the ramifications of it. In the middle are the moderately mobile. Those individuals and businesses usually delay moving until it's absolutely necessary, or they stagger it so it's not as abrupt. And then finally, the immobile group is often trapped in deteriorating conditions. They are often the last ones left in the town. Again, this is not hypothetical, this is actually happening. If anyone's interested, I didn't include it in this deck, but you can look up the city of Fair Bluff, North Carolina. That city is down to 500 people, most of whom are retired or they're unemployed or they are children. So they don't all meaningfully contribute to the tax revenue. Um, so because of that, because populations are stratified by mobility, it's going to be harder for cities to justify a lot of the investments. How do they justify maintaining the infrastructure if nobody's contributing to the tax base? So, um, going back to the doom loop that we constructed together, as I mentioned, there are interventions and case studies. Um, and the point of this was to show that the dynamics can be kind of redirected instead of reinforced. Um, with that, I thought it would also be useful to not just show things in theory, but to show real life case studies that have successfully disrupted this doom loop to show other cities that you don't need to reinvent the wheel here. There are what is known as ordinary innovations that you can adopt, which are low cost and highly effective mechanisms. Um, I'll move past these fairly quickly, but the goal here is to summarize some of those ordinary innovations that cities have already employed, other states and cities can consider. Some of these include standardized frameworks such as TCFD, which is the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, going back to the topic of disclosing climate risk. Um, Another innovation is to align these disclosures with annual budgets and bond issuance cycles. And the reason we're arguing for that is once you disclose the climate risk, it's going to become more justifiable for climate adaptation projects to get approved. So once you justify the fact that, the city disclosed this risk, therefore, we do need to have this adaptation project passed. So that misalignment helps, this helps bridge that gap. As you can see, there are quite a few innovations. We can skip this one, and I'll just go over to the next slide, which I believe is the final slide, because it shows you these exact innovations in action. So here's the same doom loop, but with disruptions. In yellow is challenge one. It's the same challenges, um, but the boxes show real life case studies on a municipal level, and the circles show disruptions and innovations. So, what's important again in this is that there's no radical innovation required. Some of these cities, for example, are already disclosing climate risk. So, Orting, Washington, disclosed volcanic lahar disclosure in their financial statements, and their bonds still sold at a premium compared to neighboring cities that didn't disclose it. It's comparable. So it wasn't even penalized for disclosing the risk. So all of this is to show that not all risks are going to be penalized. So Orting is setting the precedence here. Similarly, cities like Virginia Beach have voter approved um, a flood bond, a $567 million flood bond. The residents not only voted for it, but they also helped the city redraw the flood risk maps based on local knowledge. They said that, this flood map is really good. However, we know for a fact that certain other regions get flooded more. So it was a great exercise where the community did come together and everybody does care about it because it's their homes that are getting flooded. It's their homes that are getting burned down. So they have a vested interest in these decisions. Um, Other innovations include state credit enhancement programs, pooled financing, and like I said, standardized disclosure frameworks. All of this can help stabilize borrowing costs. Another thing that San Antonio, Texas did was it explicitly, in its climate adaptation plan, tied climate action to credit ratings and subsequently to borrowing costs, which is, again, another thing that other cities had not done before. But once they start seeing that, okay, well, if San Antonio did it, perhaps we can do it too. So it is perceived as less risky for some reason. I think it's a human behavior thing. Um, we also argue that philanthropy can play an increasingly big part, given the fact that the federal government and the private insurance agencies' safety net is eroding. So, all in all, this is to say that although the doom loop is something that a lot of cities might already be a part of or are at risk of entering, it's actually not going to be so doomy if cities begin to consider some of these innovations and adopt even one or two of these can sometimes make a big difference. So thank you so much for your attention on this. As I mentioned, you can read our paper if you follow that link, or you can scan that QR code. If you have any issues accessing, please feel free to reach out to me. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Ayushi. It was a really great presentation, especially your visualization of the disruptors and innovations were really helpful. And now we'll open up for Q&A. So I request the participants to raise your hand and you can unmute yourself and ask the question. Yeah, maybe as we wait for the participants to also ask the questions, maybe I can start till then. So I think you mentioned that the climate debt loop has migration implications, and actually also the financing for the city is dependent upon the uh, population staying there. So how are there any innovations which can actually help address this challenge?
It's such a good question. That is actually been done by certain cities in the way that their adaptation plans have now included clauses specifically on migration. So they are saying that, we are going to allocate this amount of funding for emergency housing if there's a sudden influx of people. So I think maybe it was the situation that happened in Chico that prompted this plan to get developed. But overall, it's harder to plan for the out migration than it is to plan for the in migration. Um, the out migration often, like I said, can be semi permanent or sometimes very permanent, but it can also be temporary. Um, After Hurricane Katrina, uh, a lot of people moved away for good, but a lot of people did come back to rebuild their homes. So I think it's one of those things where it depends on the severity of the situation. Um, if your house gets burned down completely versus if it got temporarily flooded, I think those things matter a lot in the decision making. So it is harder for cities to plan for that. However, if you're asking my personal opinion, I think that if cities begin to utilize municipal bonds more, um, the $4 trillion market we have been projecting should actually be 7 trillion if cities do begin to utilize it to its maximum potential. If cities begin to do that, it's going to allow them to finance resilient housing. It's going to allow them to have better roads, better infrastructure overall. And so I think people will be less inclined to move out. So it's one of those things that has a positive um, benefit without actively planning for it.
Thank you so much. I think we can go to Professor Vishal and then Mansi.
Yeah, thanks, Hashim. Thank you, Ayushi, for this very nice talk. I was not aware of many things. I'm not from this field, so also excuse the naivety in my questions. I have two questions. My first question was from the point of view of there's this very nice structure you showed through a flow diagram. I was thinking, is it dependent on the availability of data, or how can we really adapt this in the Indian context? I'm kind of taking also the liberty to assume that you know both the contexts, the USA context and Indian context.
Yeah.
That was my first question.
Sorry.
Yeah, you could all answer that question, or I could also say my second question, however you feel.
No, you go ahead, please.
Sure. And my second question was on actually, it's a bit of a selfish kind of question. Uh, I was wondering, are there ready to use calculators to translate qualitative information into quantitative numbers for in terms of dollars? how does this conversion happen? Is there a way where you could tell us how the money flows from different steps? Maybe this is too abstract a question. I mean,
No,
I
I think I know what you're asking. So um the I'll answer your second question first. So it's actually a very interesting story. This is a question that my co-advisor asked, exactly what you just did. Like, how can we do this? How can we make this link? Um, and he actually created a startup based on this. So he was able to create a, a, a tool that worked with the municipal bond market and climate risk. And they created scores for municipalities, so a risk score. So the startup is called RISQ, Risk. It was since it has been acquired by a company, a Fortune 500 company. So now that company is known as ICE, Intercontinental Exchange. So that that is one of the ways that they've done it. I think that increasingly a lot of startups are considering this, and I know that IIT Bombay is big on entrepreneurship. So there is a big gap in this market, especially when considering insurance. I think like those things are not yet being connected. Um, to your point about data, right? It's a great point. I think a big part of why there is a delayed action from various stakeholders is because there is uncertainty with climate projections. Climate projections are inherently always going to be uncertain, but you only know that if you're in the field of climate science. If you're outside of it, people get very frustrated. Like, what do you mean you don't know the weather 3 weeks from now? Right? So when you are considering the inherent uncertainty that these climate projections have, investors oftentimes think that the data is just too abstract for them to make their decisions based on some CMIP 6 tool that's telling them that, SSP 585, like, I don't know what that means. So that I think is part of why there might be some misalignment. But I think that it's unfortunately because of human behavior, it might be one of those things where while we are currently being ostriches and putting our heads in the sand, eventually, once that sand disappears or gets flooded or burned, we won't have anywhere to put our heads and we will have to incorporate these things. So I hope I answered your question. I can try again if I didn't.
No, thanks. Just follow up a quick question uh, about the work on kind of municipal bonds, right? I was thinking if it's possible to see what sort of data ultimately went into defining this, and how
Yeah.
much of it was, say, quantitative versus qualitative. Because I guess if we want to adopt this in India, one will have to see the abstract concept and apply it again based on the availability of data and
Right.
Indian context. So was
Yeah.
just thinking if such a thing is available.
Yeah, and I just remembered your question about India. So yeah, I think the way that infrastructure is financed in India is a little different. I believe the central government plays a much bigger role. Here, the federal government doesn't play any role, I think, in financing infrastructure. Um, Although I don't really know how this could be transferred to the Indian context, I have been on the side working on a similar problem, but working with sovereign bonds instead. So, in that context, because I am from India, I care very much about India's future, and I'm concerned about India's exposure to physical climate risk as well. I'm actually from Mumbai, so shout out to IIT Bombay. Um, so yeah, in terms of whether we used qualitative or quantitative, it was a mix. Unfortunately, I didn't have access to a lot of the quantitative data that I would have liked to, just because the data sets cost thousands of dollars, and um, and that's pretty unfortunate. But I am in the midst of trying to secure some of those data sets through other sources. because I do think that the more quantitative we get here, the more convincing it gets. So instead of this conceptual doom loop, if we can kind of have ground truth wants to back that up. So the data sets include bond yields, they include credit ratings, they include maturity. So whether it's a 5-year term, a 30-year, 40-year, that helps decide. And it also helps decide, what it is that your city is investing in. So overall, I think TBD and stay tuned on that. I am excited to keep pursuing this. And yeah, I'm looking forward to also considering India and sovereign bonds.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you. Thanks a lot, Ayushi. Back to you, Hashim.
Yeah. Mansi can go ahead, and I think Devduti also has a question. So after Mansi.
Hi, Aayushi. Very nice presentation. Thank you so much for it. So, my question is like, I have two questions. So, first of all, your presentation was very extreme events driven, even within climate risk. So, as per TCFT, I'm just translating from the point of India because acute risks such as the heat related impacts in India are also a big part of how we are losing money right here in India right now. So, does that translate to the US cities as well? That's my first question. And second, it's more of a me being pessimist, but in a scenario like let's say all the cities decide to they price their physical risks in the bond market and they issue their bonds supposedly because physical risks are not created equal. Will it, from an investor point of view, will it make a difference that will make some cities sort of uninvestable? Or yeah,
Yes.
yeah, so that's my
Um,
question.
Absolutely. Great questions. Yes, to your latter point, they are increasingly being considered financial no-go zones. So investors are increasingly saying, invest in aluminum foil before you invest in this one city. Um, and going back to that Venn diagram, those cities that are deemed financial no-go zones are often those that are extremely vulnerable communities. Um, and because going back to the implications of climate migration, they're often the moderately or immobile populations too. So it's going to be interesting from a researcher's point of view to see how this plays out. From a human point of view, it's very depressing, right? And I share your pessimism there. Um, with regards to the financial losses from acute stressors, yeah, absolutely. I think that um, even from a human health standpoint, right, like one heat wave has costly impacts. From an infrastructure standpoint, I think that here in the US, floods are deemed the most expensive, um, as are hurricanes, but then that's tied closely. Extreme precipitation, wind damage, all of those are so destructive, and they have always been so. However, the intensity and the frequency are growing every year or every few years. Another reason for investor inattention is the fact that a lot of these risks are more chronic than we think, in the sense, yes, we have acute events happening every year, but people usually think of things on an annual basis. A lot of people don't, and by people I mean investors and other stakeholders, they don't necessarily zoom out and say, this has been happening for the last 7 or 8 years. They think, okay, well, another year of hurricanes and high winds. Okay, got it. So if investors do begin to change their perceived timescales of their risk, and if they do start to think, even on a 5 to 10 year scale, it doesn't have to be decades long, they can help better inform their decisions. The point that you brought up that if investors do start doing this, won't it mean certain cities will just not be investable? Yeah, that's right. You are absolutely right. I don't know the answer to that. it's a systemic problem, just the way that things have been running in this country, and I think most of the world, there are going to be parts of every country that are going to be uninvestable. And whether it's a problem of government bailout or whether it's to do with, and this is getting very technical, housing buyouts, which is basically the government buys the properties and then turns them into other ventures, and it helps relocate the residents to another place. So that's known as planned relocation. Those things are very expensive. So it depends on how the state or the government in general wants to prioritize those communities. So yeah, that's a long-winded answer. I hope that gives you an idea. I also feel pessimistic a lot of times, which is why I was keen on turning this around into a slightly optimistic paper. Because as you all know, much of what we do is very saddening most of the times. So it's helpful to like change
Yeah, I
that
do also
perspective.
trip on it a lot of times. So yeah, sharing the sentiment. Thank you.
Yeah, if there are any more questions. Yeah, I think otherwise we can conclude today's webinar. Thank you so much, Ayushi, for your presentation and for the Q&A session as well. And
Oops.
yeah, thank you for sharing the paper. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Aishi. Thanks a lot. It
Thank you,
was wonderful
Professor.
presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Have a
Bye.
nice evening. Bye.